The discovery. The morning fog hung thick over Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell began his routine patrol around the palace grounds. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, and nothing much surprised him anymore. Tourists, protesters, forgotten umbrellas, lost phones. He had seen it all. But that Tuesday morning in October would change everything he thought he knew about his job. James walked his usual route along the palace's eastern wall, his polished boots clicking against the wet pavement. The early morning shift was always quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers passing by. He preferred these peaceful hours before the chaos of tourists began. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he checked each gate and entrance point, just as he had done thousands of times before. As he rounded the corner near the staff entrance, something caught his eye. There, sitting alone against the palace wall, was a battered brown leather suitcase. It looked old and worn, with scratches across its surface and a broken handle hanging loose. James stopped in his tracks. In all his years of service, he had never seen luggage left in this particular spot. This area was restricted, far from where tourists could wander, and staff members knew better than to leave personal items lying around. James approached the suitcase carefully. His training kicked in immediately. Any unattended item near the palace could be a security threat. He pulled out his radio and called for backup while keeping his distance. The suitcase looked harmless enough, but appearances could be deceiving. In today's world, royal guards couldn't take any chances. Within minutes, 2 other guards arrived, along with Detective Inspector Sarah Collins from the Metropolitan Police. Sarah had worked palace security for 8 years and had dealt with numerous suspicious packages. She examined the suitcase from several angles, noting its vintage appearance and the way it seemed to have been placed rather than dropped. "How long has it been here?" Sarah asked James, pulling on latex gloves. "I'm not sure," James replied, checking his watch. "I walked this route yesterday evening around 6 and it wasn't here then. So sometime between last night and this morning." Sarah nodded, making notes in her small notebook. The suitcase was positioned perfectly against the wall, not tilted or fallen over as it might be if someone had simply dropped it and walked away. Someone had deliberately placed it there. But why? And why choose this particular spot away from the main entrances and tourist areas? The detective called for the bomb disposal unit as a precaution. Protocol demanded that any suspicious package near the royal residence be treated as a potential explosive device until proven otherwise. While they waited, Sarah and James examined the area around the suitcase for any clues about who might have left it there. The ground was still damp from the previous night's rain, but there were no clear footprints leading to or from the suitcase. The security cameras in this area had been undergoing maintenance, leaving a small blind spot exactly where the suitcase now sat. This seemed too convenient to be a coincidence. 20 minutes later, the bomb disposal team arrived in their specialized van. The technicians, dressed in protective gear, approached the suitcase with their detection equipment. They scanned it carefully with metal detectors and X-ray devices, looking for any signs of explosive materials or dangerous contents. "It's not a bomb," announced the lead technician after completing the scan. "But there's definitely something inside. Looks like papers, maybe some metal objects. Nothing that appears threatening, but we should open it carefully." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. If it wasn't a security threat, then what was it? Why would someone leave an old suitcase in such a specific location? She had a feeling this was going to be more complicated than a simple case of abandoned luggage. The bomb disposal team carefully moved the suitcase to a secure area where it could be opened safely. Sarah, James, and several other officials gathered around as the technicians worked on the old brass locks. The suitcase looked like it came from another era, probably from the 1950s or 1960s, based on its design and the way the leather had aged. As the first lock clicked open, everyone held their breath. The second lock proved more stubborn, requiring some gentle persuasion with specialized tools. Finally, both locks released and the lid of the suitcase could be lifted. What they found inside made everyone stare in stunned silence. The suitcase was filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be personal belongings from decades ago. The papers were yellowed with age, and many bore official government stamps and seals. Some documents had classified markings that were clearly visible even from a distance. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the first document on top. It was a letter written on official letterhead, dated 1953. The handwriting was neat and formal, and the signature at the bottom made her gasp. She recognized the name immediately. It belonged to someone who had been dead for over 30 years, someone whose secrets should have died with them. "We need to contact MI5 immediately," Sarah whispered, carefully replacing the letter in the suitcase. "This is way above our security level." James looked over her shoulder, trying to see what had made the detective so pale. "What is it? What did you find?" Sarah closed the suitcase lid and signaled for the area to be secured. "I can't say for certain yet, but these documents, they could rewrite history. Someone wanted them found, and they wanted them found here, at the palace. We need to figure out who, and more importantly, why now." As they waited for MI5 agents to arrive, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Someone had gone to great lengths to place this suitcase exactly where it would be discovered by palace security. This wasn't random. It was planned, deliberate, and potentially explosive in ways that had nothing to do with bombs. The autumn morning had started like any other, but James Mitchell knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The key contents of that forgotten suitcase were about to change everything they thought they knew about the past, and possibly the future as well. The investigation begins. MI5 agents arrived at Buckingham Palace within the hour, their black cars pulling up quietly to avoid attracting attention. Agent Rebecca Thompson, a specialist in historical intelligence cases, took charge of the investigation. She had spent 15 years dealing with classified materials and state secrets, but even she seemed troubled by what Sarah Collins had briefly described over the phone. Rebecca examined the suitcase with the careful attention of someone who understood that historical documents could be more dangerous than weapons. The leather case had clearly been stored somewhere safe for decades before being deliberately placed at the palace. Every detail suggested careful planning rather than random abandonment. "Tell me exactly how you found this," Rebecca asked James Mitchell, her voice calm but intense. "Every detail matters, no matter how small it might seem." James recounted his morning patrol, describing the exact location where the suitcase had been positioned. He explained how it sat perfectly against the wall, not fallen or dropped, but placed with intention. The more he talked, the more convinced Rebecca became that someone had chosen this location very carefully. "The security camera blind spot," Rebecca noted, studying the maintenance records. "When was this scheduled?" The maintenance supervisor, who had been called to the scene, checked his files nervously. "The work was scheduled 3 months ago, but we only started yesterday morning. We were supposed to finish today." Rebecca exchanged a meaningful look with Sarah. Someone had known about the camera maintenance schedule. This wasn't the work of an outsider. Someone with inside knowledge had planned this carefully. With proper security protocols in place, Rebecca finally opened the suitcase again. The documents inside were organized in folders, each marked with dates spanning from 1952 to 1964. Many bore the seals of government departments that no longer existed, and some had security classifications that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. The first folder contained correspondence between high-ranking government officials and members of the royal household. The letters discussed events that had never been made public, decisions that had shaped the course of British history in ways the public never knew. Rebecca recognized several names, people who had become famous for entirely different reasons than what these documents revealed. In the second folder, she found photographs, black and white images showing meetings that had supposedly never taken place, handshakes between people who were officially enemies, and gatherings in locations that should have remained secret forever. Each photo was carefully labeled with dates, times, and locations in the same neat handwriting they had seen on the letters. "My God," whispered Sarah, looking over Rebecca's shoulder at one particular photograph. "Is that really?" "I can't confirm identities yet," Rebecca said carefully, "but we need to verify the authenticity of everything here immediately. If these documents are genuine, they could change how we understand several major historical events." The third folder contained what appeared to be financial records. Bank transfers, payments made to various individuals and organizations, and detailed accounting of funds that officially never existed. The amounts were staggering, even by today's standards, and the purposes listed made Rebecca realize why these documents had been hidden for so long. James watched the investigators work, fascinated by their reactions to each new discovery. "What kind of secrets are we talking about here?" he asked. "I mean, it's been over 60 years. Surely it can't matter that much now?" Rebecca looked up from the documents, her expression serious. "Some secrets become more dangerous with time, not less. The people involved may be dead, but their families, their legacies, and the institutions they built are still very much alive. Information like this could destroy reputations, bring down governments, and shake public faith in institutions that people depend on." As they continued examining the contents, they found a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only by proper authority." Inside was a handwritten note that made everyone in the room fall silent. The note was brief but explosive, naming names and describing events that had been officially denied for decades. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone old or ill, and it was signed with a name they all recognized. A person who had died just 3 months ago. A former intelligence officer who had served his country faithfully for over 50 years before retiring to quiet obscurity. He left this for us to find, Rebecca realized, reading the note again. This wasn't abandoned or stolen. Someone who knew these secrets decided it was time for the truth to come out, and they chose to do it this way. The note explained that the suitcase had been in the writer's possession for decades, given to him by someone even higher up the chain of command, who had died with the promise that these secrets would someday be revealed, when the time was right. The old intelligence officer had waited until his own death was near, then arranged for the suitcase to be discovered in a way that would ensure it received proper attention. Sarah studied the timeline carefully. So he must have arranged for someone else to place this here after he died, someone he trusted to carry out his final wishes. Rebecca nodded, but her mind was racing with the implications. We need to find out who helped him. That person might have more information, or there might be more documents hidden elsewhere. As the day progressed, experts in historical documents, handwriting analysis, and photograph authentication arrived to examine the suitcase's contents. Each specialist who looked at the materials confirmed what Rebecca already suspected. Everything appeared to be genuine, and the implications were staggering. The photographs showed meetings between British officials and foreign agents during some of the most sensitive periods of the Cold War. The documents revealed decisions made in secret that had affected millions of lives. The financial records exposed funding for operations that had never been officially acknowledged. By evening, Rebecca had made the decision to expand the investigation significantly. This was no longer just about an abandoned suitcase. It was about uncovering a network of secrets that stretched back over half a century and involved some of the most powerful people in British history. "We need to be very careful about how we proceed," Rebecca warned her team as they prepared to leave the palace. "If word of this gets out before we understand the full scope, it could cause panic, destroy trust in government institutions, and potentially compromise ongoing operations that we don't even know about yet." James Mitchell returned to his regular duties that evening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something much bigger than anyone realized. The forgotten suitcase had opened a door to the past, and what lay beyond that door might change the present in ways no one could predict. As Rebecca drove back to MI5 headquarters with the suitcase secured in her car, she wondered who else knew about these secrets. The old intelligence officer couldn't have been acting alone. Someone had helped him plan this revelation, and that person was still out there, waiting to see what would happen next. Secrets revealed. The MI5 headquarters buzzed with activity as Rebecca Thompson and her team worked through the night analyzing the suitcase contents. Document experts had confirmed the authenticity of the papers using various dating techniques, ink analysis, and paper composition tests. Everything pointed to the materials being genuine artifacts from the 1950s and 1960s. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a historian specializing in Cold War intelligence, had been called in to help interpret the documents. As she carefully read through each file, her expression grew more troubled. These weren't just minor secrets or embarrassing revelations. They were game-changing pieces of information that could reshape understanding of major historical events. This document here, Dr. Hayes pointed to a letter dated 1956, suggests that the British government had advanced knowledge of the Suez Crisis attack plan weeks before it was supposed to be a spontaneous response. And this one indicates secret negotiations with Soviet agents during the Cuban Missile Crisis that were never officially acknowledged. Rebecca leaned over the historian's shoulder, studying the careful handwriting and official seals. What's the significance? Why would someone risk exposing this information now? Because, Dr. Hayes explained, these documents prove that many of the official historical records are incomplete or deliberately misleading. They show that British intelligence was involved in operations that were officially denied, and that some of our greatest diplomatic successes were actually the result of secret deals that the public was never meant to know about. The photographs were equally revealing. Image analysis experts had confirmed their authenticity and identified many of the people shown: high-ranking British officials meeting with foreign agents, handshakes between supposed enemies, and gatherings in locations that should have been impossible for security reasons. One photograph particularly caught Rebecca's attention. It showed a meeting in what appeared to be a private dining room, with 5 people seated around a table. 2 were British intelligence officers she recognized from historical records. 2 were foreign agents from countries Britain was officially at odds with. And the 5th person made her heart race. It was someone whose identity would shock the nation if revealed. "We need to verify this person's identity absolutely," Rebecca told the photo analysis team. "If this is who I think it is, we're dealing with information that could destabilize the government." As dawn broke over London, Rebecca received a call that changed everything. The phone number found in the suitcase, written on a small piece of paper tucked inside one of the folders, had been traced to a nursing home in Surrey. The number belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 89-year-old former government secretary who had worked in the intelligence services during the 1950s and 1960s. Rebecca and Sarah Collins drove to the nursing home immediately. They found Mrs. Whitfield, sitting in the garden, feeding birds and enjoying the morning sunshine. Despite her age, her eyes were sharp and alert, and she seemed to be expecting them. "You found his suitcase, didn't you?" Mrs. Whitfield asked before they could introduce themselves. "Thomas said someone would come looking for me eventually." Thomas Morrison was the name of the former intelligence officer who had died 3 months or earlier, the man who had written the final note in the suitcase. Rebecca sat down beside the elderly woman, her voice gentle but urgent. "Mrs. Whitfield, we need to understand what Thomas was trying to achieve. These documents could have serious implications for national security." Eleanor smiled sadly, her weathered hands continuing to scatter breadcrumbs for the birds. Thomas carried those secrets for over 50 years. They ate away at him, knowing what really happened during those years, knowing that the history books were full of lies and half-truths. He promised his superiors he would never reveal what he knew, but as he got older, he felt the weight of those promises more and more. She explained that Thomas had been her supervisor during the early 1960s, and that she had helped him organize and maintain the secret files that eventually ended up in the suitcase. When Thomas became ill earlier in the year, he had contacted Eleanor and asked for her help in ensuring the documents would be discovered after his death. "But why now?" Sarah asked. "Why did he choose this moment to reveal everything?" Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "Because some of the people involved in those old secrets are still alive, still in positions of power. Thomas believed that certain decisions being made today are based on the same kind of secret deals and hidden agendas that shaped policy 50 years ago. He thought the public deserved to know the truth about how their government really operates." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a key. "This opens a safety deposit box at the Westminster Bank. Thomas made me promise to give this to whoever came asking about the suitcase. He said there's more information there, information that explains why these old secrets are still relevant." Today, Rebecca took the key, her mind racing with possibilities. "What kind of information? More documents from the past or something current?" "Both," Eleanor replied simply. Thomas spent his retirement years tracking the connections between the old operations and current political activities. He discovered that some of the networks established during the Cold War never really went away. They just evolved and adapted to new circumstances. As they drove back to London with the safety deposit box key, Rebecca and Sarah discussed the implications of what they had learned. If Eleanor was telling the truth, then the suitcase wasn't just about exposing historical secrets. It was about revealing ongoing operations that connected the past to the present. The safety deposit box, when they finally gained access to it later that day, contained exactly what Eleanor had suggested: modern documents, computer printouts, bank records, and photographs that showed how some of the same families, organizations, and financial networks involved in the 1950s operations were still active today. Thomas Morrison had spent his final years creating a comprehensive map of connections spanning 7 decades. He had tracked money flows, family relationships, business partnerships, and political appointments that showed how certain influential groups had maintained power and influence across multiple generations. "This is incredible," Dr. Hayes whispered as she studied Thomas's research. "He's documented a shadow network of influence that has shaped British policy for over half a century. Some of these people and organizations are still operating today, still making decisions that affect millions of lives." Rebecca realized that they were no longer just investigating historical secrets. They were uncovering ongoing activities that could have immediate implications for national security and political stability. The forgotten suitcase had been the key to unlocking a much larger and more complex truth. As she prepared her preliminary report for her superiors, Rebecca wondered if Thomas Morrison had really done the country a favor by exposing these secrets, or if he had opened a door that should have remained closed forever. The information was powerful enough to bring down governments and destroy lives, but it was also the kind of truth that might be necessary for democracy to function properly. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: the discovery of that suitcase was going to change everything, not just about the past, but about the present and future as well. The network exposed Rebecca Thompson found herself at the center of the most complex intelligence investigation of her career. The contents of Thomas Morrison's safety deposit box had revealed a web of connections that stretched from the highest levels of government to private corporations, financial institutions, and even charitable organizations. What had started as a simple case of an abandoned suitcase was now threatening to expose decades of hidden influence and secret cooperation. The modern documents in the safety deposit box showed that many of the relationships established during the Cold War had never ended. Instead, they had evolved and adapted, creating an unofficial network of influence that operated parallel to official government channels. Thomas Morrison had spent years documenting phone calls, meetings, financial transfers, and decision-making patterns that revealed how this network continued to shape policy. Dr. Margaret Hayes worked alongside Rebecca to understand the historical context of what they were discovering. "Look at this pattern," she explained, spreading documents across the conference table at MI5 headquarters. In 1962, there was a secret agreement to share certain types of intelligence with foreign agents. The official records show this arrangement ended in 1968, but Thomas's documentation suggests it never really stopped. It just became more sophisticated and harder to detect. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed regular payments to individuals who officially had no connection to intelligence work. Phone records revealed frequent communication between people who were supposed to be on opposite sides of various international disputes. Meeting logs documented gatherings that brought together government officials, business leaders, and foreign representatives in ways that would have been scandalous if made public. Rebecca's team had identified at least 30 individuals who appeared to be part of this network, including several who were still alive and active in politics, business, or international relations. Some were household names, people whose reputations for integrity and public service were beyond question in the public eye. The most shocking revelation came when they cross-referenced Thomas's modern research with the historical documents from the suitcase. The same families and organizations that had been involved in secret operations during the 1950s were still connected to current decision-makers through business partnerships, marriages, educational institutions, and charitable foundations. It's like a shadow government, Sarah Collins observed as she studied the relationship charts they had created. These people aren't officially in charge of anything, but they seem to have influence over almost everything. Rebecca nodded grimly. And the scary part is that most of it appears to be legal. They're not breaking laws. They're just using relationships, money, and information in ways that give them power without accountability. The investigation took a dramatic turn when they discovered that some of the network's current activities involved ongoing intelligence operations. Thomas Morrison had uncovered evidence that certain foreign policy decisions were being influenced by the same kind of secret agreements that had shaped events during the Cold War. Phone intercepts from Thomas's files revealed conversations about arms deals that were never officially approved, diplomatic negotiations that contradicted public statements, and financial arrangements that seemed designed to benefit specific individuals rather than national interests. The recordings were from just 2 years ago, proving that whatever Thomas had discovered was still actively happening. Rebecca realized she was facing a dilemma that went beyond normal intelligence work. If she reported everything they had found to her superiors, she would be exposing activities that might be sanctioned at the highest levels of government. Some of the people identified in Thomas's research held positions that would make them her superiors' superiors. We need to be very careful about who we trust with this information, Rebecca warned her team during a late-night briefing. Thomas Morrison died under what appeared to be natural circumstances. But given what he knew and what he was planning to expose, we can't rule out the possibility that his death wasn't as natural as it seemed. The team decided to secretly investigate Thomas Morrison's final months. Medical records showed he had been suffering from heart problems, and his death certificate listed cardiac arrest as the cause of death. However, when they spoke to his neighbors and friends, they learned some disturbing details about his final weeks. Mrs. Whitfield, when contacted again, revealed that Thomas had been increasingly paranoid in his final months. He had mentioned being followed, receiving threatening phone calls, and finding evidence that someone had been in his house when he was away. She had dismissed these concerns as the fears of an aging man, but now they seemed more significant. He gave me very specific instructions about the suitcase, Mrs. Whitfield told Rebecca during a second meeting. He said if anything happened to him, I was to wait exactly 3 months before having it placed at the palace. He was very precise about the timing and the location. Thomas had also left detailed instructions about how to avoid the security cameras and how to ensure the suitcase would be found by palace guards rather than tourists or cleaning staff. He had studied the palace security routines and identified the perfect opportunity to have his secrets discovered. Rebecca's investigation revealed that Thomas had been in contact with several journalists during his final year, but he had never given them any specific information. Instead, he had been trying to identify reporters who could be trusted with sensitive information and who had the resources to investigate complex stories properly. The safety deposit box had contained contact information for 3 journalists, along with detailed notes about their backgrounds, their previous work, and Thomas's assessment of their reliability. It was clear that he had been planning to release his information through the media if the government failed to act on what he had discovered. He was preparing multiple options, Rebecca realized as she studied Thomas's notes. The suitcase was his first choice. Get the information to intelligence services and let them handle it properly. But if that didn't work, or if they tried to cover it up, he had backup plans to ensure the information would still become public. The pressure on Rebecca's team intensified when they discovered that some of the people identified in Thomas's research were aware they were being investigated. Phone calls were being made, meetings were being arranged, and there were signs that the network Thomas had exposed was taking steps to protect itself. We're running out of time, Sarah warned Rebecca as they reviewed the latest surveillance reports. If they realize how much we know, they're going to start destroying evidence and silencing witnesses. We need to decide what we're going to do with this information, and we need to decide quickly. Rebecca stared at the wall covered with photographs, documents, and relationship charts that mapped out 7 decades of secret influence and hidden power. Thomas Morrison had spent years collecting this evidence, knowing that exposing it might cost him his life. Now she had to decide whether his sacrifice would mean anything, or whether these secrets would be buried once again. The investigation had reached a critical point. Rebecca knew that her next decision would determine not only the fate of Thomas Morrison's revelations but also her own future, and possibly the future of British democracy itself. The network that Thomas had exposed was powerful, connected, and dangerous, but it was also vulnerable now that its existence had been documented so thoroughly. The question was whether anyone in the government could be trusted to do something about it, or whether the network's influence had already spread too far to be stopped. The dangerous truth. Rebecca Thompson's investigation had reached a dangerous crossroads. As she delved deeper into Thomas Morrison's evidence, she discovered that the network he had exposed wasn't just influential, it was actively working to protect itself. Phone surveillance revealed urgent conversations between network members, coded language about cleaning up loose ends, and references to the Morrison problem that made Rebecca's blood run cold. The breakthrough came when Rebecca's team intercepted a phone call between two high-ranking officials discussing how to contain the palace discovery. The conversation revealed that certain people in government had been expecting Thomas Morrison to make his move eventually, and they had been preparing countermeasures for months. They knew he was planning something, Rebecca told her trusted team members during a secure briefing. Thomas Morrison wasn't as careful as he thought he was. Someone was watching him during his final months, and they know exactly what he had planned. Sarah Collins had been conducting her own parallel investigation into Thomas Morrison's death. What she found contradicted the official medical reports. 3 witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar people near Thomas's house on the night he died. His neighbor had noticed a van parked across the street for several nights running before his death, but it had disappeared immediately after the ambulance took Thomas away. The cardiac arrest was real, Sarah explained to Rebecca, but it might have been induced. There are several substances that can trigger heart failure in someone who already has heart problems, and they leave no trace after death. Thomas had been receiving treatment for his condition for years, so no one would question a cardiac event. Rebecca realized that Thomas Morrison's death hadn't been the end of the network's concerns. It had been just the beginning. By arranging for the suitcase to be discovered after his death, Thomas had forced the network to take action while investigators were still uncovering the full scope of his evidence. The investigation took a personal turn when Rebecca discovered that her own supervisor, Director Michael Hartwell, appeared in several of Thomas Morrison's modern documents. Phone records showed regular contact between Hartwell and known network members, and financial records revealed payments to consulting companies that Hartwell's wife owned. "I can't trust anyone in the official chain of command," Rebecca confided to Sarah during a private meeting in a secure location outside MI5 headquarters. Thomas Morrison knew this would happen. That's why he arranged for the evidence to be discovered by palace security, instead of going through normal intelligence channels. Sarah had reached the same conclusion through her own investigation. The network has people placed throughout the government. They've been planning for this possibility for years. Thomas Morrison was a threat to something much bigger than we initially understood. Rebecca decided to take an enormous risk. Instead of following normal protocols and reporting her findings to Director Hartwell, she contacted one of the journalists from Thomas Morrison's list. David Kellner was an investigative reporter with The Guardian, who had spent decades covering intelligence operations and government corruption. Thomas's notes indicated that Kellner could be trusted with sensitive information and had the resources to verify complex stories independently. The meeting took place in a small cafe in Camden, far from government buildings and surveillance networks. Rebecca arrived early and watched for signs of surveillance before approaching Kellner's table. The journalist was younger than she had expected, but his reputation for thorough investigation was well established. Thomas Morrison left very specific instructions about contacting you, Rebecca began carefully. He believed you were someone who could handle sensitive information responsibly. Kellner listened intently as Rebecca outlined the basic facts of what they had discovered. She didn't reveal specific names or documents, but she painted a picture of a shadow network that had influenced British policy for decades. The journalist's questions revealed that he already knew more about such networks than Rebecca had expected. Thomas Morrison wasn't the only intelligence officer who became concerned about ongoing secret operations, Kellner explained. I've been receiving hints and tips from various sources for years, but no one has ever been willing to provide concrete evidence. Most of these people are too afraid of the consequences. Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. Thomas Morrison wasn't afraid of the consequences. He documented everything, and he wanted the truth to come out. But I need your help to make sure that happens safely. Over the following week, Rebecca secretly copied key documents from Thomas Morrison's evidence and provided them to Kellner for independent verification. The journalist had contacts throughout Europe and America who could confirm details about the foreign connections mentioned in the files. He also had technical experts who could verify the authenticity of documents and photographs using methods that were independent of government resources. Meanwhile, pressure was building within MI5. Director Hartwell had begun asking pointed questions about the investigation's progress and demanding detailed reports about what had been discovered. Rebecca provided carefully edited information that revealed some of the historical aspects of the case, while concealing the modern connections and the evidence of ongoing activities. The situation became critical when Sarah Collins reported that she was being followed. Professional surveillance teams had been tracking her movements for several days, and she had noticed the same vehicles and individuals in multiple locations. Someone was monitoring the investigators, which meant the network knew exactly how much progress had been made. They're not just watching us, Sarah realized during an emergency meeting with Rebecca. They're positioning themselves to take action. I think they're planning to discredit the investigation or eliminate the evidence before it can be acted upon. Rebecca's fears were confirmed when she arrived at her office to find that her computer access had been restricted, and several key files from the investigation had been classified at levels above her security clearance. Official reasons were given: routine security reviews and data protection protocols. But the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. David Kellner's independent investigation had confirmed many of the details from Thomas Morrison's documents. The journalist had verified financial transfers, confirmed the identities of people in photographs, and traced connections between historical events and current political activities. His sources in other countries had provided additional information that corroborated Thomas Morrison's research. The story is ready to publish, Kellner told Rebecca during another secret meeting. But once it goes public, there will be massive pressure to discredit both you and the evidence. Are you prepared for what's going to happen? Rebecca knew that publishing the story would end her career in intelligence work and possibly put her life in danger. But she also knew that Thomas Morrison had risked everything to ensure these secrets would be revealed, and countless others had suffered because of the network's hidden influence over policy decisions. Thomas Morrison spent 50 years carrying these secrets, Rebecca replied. He died trying to make sure the truth would come out. I can't let his sacrifice be meaningless. The decision was made. Kellner would publish his story within 48 hours, revealing the existence of the shadow network and providing enough evidence to force official investigations. Rebecca would simultaneously provide copies of all evidence to trusted contacts in Parliament, the press, and international intelligence agencies to ensure the information couldn't be suppressed. As Rebecca prepared for the storm that was about to break, she thought about James Mitchell, the Royal Guard whose routine patrol had started everything. He had no idea that finding an abandoned suitcase would expose decades of hidden corruption and secret influence. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen by accident, made by ordinary people doing their jobs honestly. The network that Thomas Morrison had spent years documenting was about to face its greatest challenge. For the first time in decades, their existence would be exposed to public scrutiny. Whether they would survive that scrutiny remained to be seen, but their days of operating in complete secrecy were about to end. For the aftermath, the story broke at exactly 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning. David Kellner's investigation appeared simultaneously in The Guardian and was picked up by news outlets across the world within hours. The headline read, "The Shadow Network: How Secret Influence Shaped British Policy for 7 Decades." The impact was immediate and explosive. Rebecca Thompson watched the news coverage from a safe house outside London, knowing that her life had changed forever. Within an hour of publication, her access to MI5 facilities had been terminated, her security clearance had been suspended, and official statements were being prepared to discredit both her and the investigation. The response was so swift and coordinated that it confirmed everything Thomas Morrison had suspected about the network's reach and influence. James Mitchell, the royal guard who had discovered the suitcase, found himself at the center of a media storm he never could have imagined. Reporters surrounded Buckingham Palace asking about security procedures and trying to interview anyone connected to the discovery. James was instructed by his superiors not to speak to the press, but he watched the news coverage with fascination, finally understanding why that abandoned suitcase had caused such an extraordinary reaction. The government's response followed, a predictable pattern. Prime Minister's questions in Parliament became a battleground as opposition members demanded investigations and explanations. The official line was that the documents were either forgeries or taken out of context, and that any legitimate historical materials had already been properly reviewed by appropriate authorities. Director Michael Hartwell held a press conference, where he characterized Rebecca Thompson as a rogue agent who had violated her oath of service and compromised national security by sharing classified materials with journalists. He claimed that the investigation had been properly conducted and that no evidence of wrongdoing had been found. But Thomas Morrison had anticipated this response. The safety deposit box had contained one final surprise that Rebecca had kept in reserve, video recordings that Thomas had secretly made during his final months. The recordings showed meetings between network members, phone calls discussing how to handle the Morrison problem, and conversations that proved the network's knowledge of ongoing illegal activities. David Kellner released the videos 48 hours after his initial story, just as government denials were reaching their peak. The recordings were devastating. They showed high-ranking officials discussing how to manipulate intelligence reports, foreign policy decisions being made to benefit private business interests, and casual references to eliminating threats to the network's security. The videos changed everything. What had been dismissed as unverifiable historical documents suddenly became current evidence of ongoing corruption and conspiracy. The recordings provided voices, faces, and undeniable proof that the network Thomas Morrison had documented was not only real, but actively working to protect itself from exposure. Public reaction was swift and angry. Protests began outside government buildings within hours of the video's release. Citizens who had trusted their leaders for decades felt betrayed and deceived. The revelation that major policy decisions had been influenced by secret agreements and hidden agendas shook public faith in democratic institutions. International implications emerged quickly as foreign governments identified their own nationals in Thomas Morrison's documents. Several countries launched investigations into whether their officials had been compromised by the British network. Intelligence relationships that had existed for decades came under scrutiny, as allies questioned whether they could trust information and cooperation that might have been tainted by hidden agendas. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the elderly former secretary who had helped Thomas Morrison plan the revelation, became an unexpected hero to many people. Her decision to honor Thomas's final wishes, despite the personal risk, was seen as an example of ordinary courage in the face of extraordinary corruption. She received thousands of letters of support, though she also required police protection. After receiving threats from unknown sources, the legal aftermath proved complex. While the evidence of historical corruption was overwhelming, proving current criminal activity was more difficult. Many of the network's recent activities had been carefully structured to remain technically legal, even if morally questionable. Prosecutors struggled to build cases against individuals who had used influence and relationships rather than outright bribery or coercion. Several high-ranking officials resigned, for personal reasons, in the weeks following the revelations. Others were reassigned to less sensitive positions or took early retirement. The network that had operated for decades began to fragment as members distanced themselves from each other and from activities that were now under public scrutiny. Rebecca Thompson faced legal challenges for her role in releasing classified information, but public support for her actions made prosecution politically difficult. A legal defense fund established by civil rights organizations raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for her defense. Opinion polls showed that a majority of the public viewed her as a whistleblower rather than a traitor. The investigation expanded far beyond what Thomas Morrison had originally documented. Parliamentary committees, judicial inquiries, and international investigations uncovered additional evidence of the network's activities and influence. What had begun with a single suitcase evolved into the largest investigation of government corruption in British history. James Mitchell returned to his duties as a Royal Guard, but his routine patrol route would never feel the same. He had become part of history by simply doing his job honestly and reporting what he found. Palace officials commended him for following proper security procedures, and he received letters from citizens thanking him for his role in exposing the truth. Dr. Margaret Hayes, the historian who had helped interpret the documents, found herself at the center of efforts to rewrite official histories based on the newly revealed information. Universities and research institutions began reviewing decades of historical records to identify other areas where official accounts might have been incomplete or misleading. The story's impact extended far beyond Britain. Other countries began examining their own intelligence archives for evidence of similar networks or hidden influence operations. International organizations implemented new transparency requirements for government interactions, and several nations strengthened their laws regarding secret agreements and undisclosed foreign influence. 1 year after the discovery of the suitcase, a memorial service was held for Thomas Morrison. Rebecca Thompson, Sarah Collins, David Kellner, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, and James Mitchell all attended, along with hundreds of citizens who credited Thomas with helping to restore honesty to their government. The shadow network that had operated for 7 decades still existed in some form, but its power had been permanently diminished by exposure to public scrutiny. Some members faced criminal charges, others had lost their positions and influence, and all were now operating under the watchful eyes of investigators, journalists, and an informed public. Thomas Morrison's gamble had paid off. By risking everything to expose the truth, he had given his country the chance to confront decades of hidden corruption and secret influence. The forgotten suitcase that James Mitchell had found during his morning patrol had become the key to unlocking a more honest and accountable government. The investigation would continue for years, but the most important victory had already been achieved. The public now knew that their democracy had been compromised, and they were determined to ensure it would not happen again. Sometimes the most important changes in history begin with the simplest discoveries made by ordinary people who choose to do the right thing when faced with extraordinary circumstances.